Just a quick thank you for everyone who's here and for coming. We're going to start in about 30 seconds. We'll just give a few more moments. Get sorted. Starting to fill in. All right, well, just to let everyone know, we are recording this session. It'll be available for view later for those who can or can't attend. And I want to thank everyone, first off, if you made it. Sorry for the confusion. We had to switch up the invite links earlier today due to a bit of a malicious attack on the county in the virtual world. So that had a bit of an impact on us, but we're ready to go now. Again, I want to welcome everyone. I want to thank you for coming. My name's Scott France. If you don't know me, I'm the Executive Director of the Montgomery County Planning Commission. And today we're excited. This is our first free event of the 2022 Planning Smarter series. We've already had some training sessions under that series with PMPI, but this is one of our flagship events. And Planning Smarter, if you're not familiar with it, it aims to bring in-depth planning topics and resources to our municipal and regional partners in and around Montgomery County. We try to cast a wide net, and anyone who's interested to benefit from these presentations. Today is a hot topic session, and this is a return to a unique format that we started last year. As we were coming out of the pandemic, we decided to have some more timely sessions, shorter to the punch, but also reacting to what was really happening on the ground with our communities. We typically tend to do Planning Smarter events as a singular focus or an issue like walk and bike Monco strategies or the economic benefits to preserving open space. And those didn't come out of the blue. Those are our upcoming Planning Smarter events. So I just worked a shameless plug in there. You'll hear more about those at the end. But we wanted to dedicate one of our events in the year to a collection of topics that are relevant to what we see happening today in our communities and provide timely value to our colleagues, our municipal partners, and the general public. So last year we inaugurated with a top session on multifamily apartments boom, the sustainable housing units, social equity, and supporting commercial centers during the pandemic recovery. That session, by the way, is still available on our YouTube channel, if any of those drew interest. And so today we have three new topics, and these touch on a theme of big changes on a small scale. Infill development, electric vehicles, and testing your local ordinance. They each begin with a fairly isolated change that is expected to blossom into a significant impact for your community, whether it's the singular tract ripe for redevelopment to a distinctly new or different use, the independent progression of our automobile reliance shifting to a different source of power, or updating your local zoning or saldo code and acknowledging the full scope of that update, especially when some of those changes could be unintended. In just a moment, you'll begin hearing from an array of our very talented staff here at the Planning Commission, along with some excellent guests that have interesting experiences to share. And one final note on our format, each presentation is expected to go about 20 minutes with multiple speakers, and then we've set aside some time after each presentation for a Q&A or even some light discussion or the start of a good discussion. Not only do we want to answer your questions, but we also want to hear what you have to say or have you share your experiences on these issues. If you do have any questions, feel free during the presentation to enter them into the chat and we'll address them afterward. Or you can also hold on to it and ask them directly in a traditional web meeting format. We wanted to make this an open, it's not the true webinar format where everyone kind of sits in silence. We hope to have this be more interactive and available to talk if you'd like. So finally, I also want to let you know, I think I said this up front, we are recording this and we'll be posting it to our Planning Smarter webpage. That's at montcopa.org/Planning Smarter. As well as the PowerPoint presentations will be available there as well in PDF format. So with all that said, we're ready to begin our first session, and we're going to lead off with Mike Narcowich, our Assistant Manager of the Community Planning Section and Infill Development. Mike, you ready?
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Scott. In this first presentation, we're going to talk about how to successfully add infill to your developed community. We'll discuss the benefits of infill, concerns it may raise, and strategies for helping it fit well into your community. Infill development can occur in various forms. Generally, it occurs in urbanized and developed areas, and it increases the residential density or non-residential intensity of a use. One form of infill development is new development on vacant land. In the images above, one lot was subdivided into 3, with new homes being built on each of the new lots. Another form is adding new buildings to a developed site. The project pictured involved constructing a new 2-story mixed-use building on a former parking lot. And another form is demolition and new construction. Sometimes this occurs because a property owner decides to demolish an outdated or inefficient use, but particularly in the case of rising property values, the property owner may choose to demolish existing development and build a new use, which yields a greater financial return than the old one. On the site pictured, new twin residential units were constructed on the site of what had been private tennis courts. And then there's adaptive reuse. This is also a form of infill or something very close to infill. One example is the Boardtown Burial Casket Factory in East Greenville Borough. It's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The borough first adopted zoning allowing the conversion of industrial into residential use, and then an underutilized factory was reused for a mixed income 71-unit apartment house known as the Willows at East Greenville. And now, Chloe Mohr will talk about the benefits of infill development.
Thanks, Mike. So now we know what we're talking about is infill. It occurs in developed areas. And in a lot of ways, infill helps us implement some of the goals from our comprehensive plan. As you know, Montgomery County is a desirable place to live, work, and do business. The county continues to grow and to develop. If we direct that development to places where infrastructure already exists, it creates more of a tax base to support the ongoing maintenance and eventual replacement of existing infrastructure. Pictured here, Conshohocken Borough already has streets, sidewalks, streetlights, sewers, water, electricity, gas, etc. New development as infill in a place like Conshohocken will support the ongoing maintenance of those services. Infill development also helps to minimize the loss of open space and farmland in other parts of the county. However, even in developed areas, we still support the protection and preservation of important natural features such as steep slopes, floodplains. In general, infill has the potential to support housing availability and affordability by creating more housing units, increasing supply. Infill development also has the greater potential to include a variety of housing types, providing more opportunities for different sizes and types of households to find a place to live. One particular type of infill housing that we sometimes see is called an accessory dwelling unit, or an ADU. An ADU is added to a lot with a single-family home, allowing for a small increase in density while maintaining the look and feel of a single-family neighborhood. Infill development can support economic development by attracting new businesses to developed areas. New businesses may be drawn to locate in new development and near significant residential density and housing options. Infill development can also support struggling retail corridors, such as our Main Street corridors throughout the county. Providing more housing units near existing businesses provides more shoppers for for existing small and local businesses. Finally, infill development supports transportation choices because already developed areas are more likely to have a variety of transportation mode options. Pictured here are the courts at Spring Mill Station. They're right next to SEPTA's Regional Rail Station. Also has direct access to the Schuylkill River Trail, and it's walking distance to downtown Conshohocken. So I'm going to turn it over to John Miklos, who will discuss some of the concerns that come up about infill development and how those can be addressed.
Okay, thanks, Chloe. So as we just heard, infill development has many advantages, but constructing new buildings in an already developed area is not without challenges. Infill development, like all development, has impacts on its surroundings, so it's important to identify the community's concerns and find ways to address them. So let's take a look at a few of the more common concerns associated with infill and the tools we can use to manage them. Parking, of course, is a major concern coming up early and often. All the residents, customers, clients, and employees that come with new development require some new parking. So setting parking requirements can help to ensure that infill development provides for its own parking needs. And through design standards, you can help to ensure that that infill development's parking doesn't have negative impacts on the surroundings, whether visual or otherwise. Parking requirements, of course, can often be a make or break factor for new development. So shared parking or reduced requirements can be used as an incentive for desired outcomes, such as housing preservation or historic preservation. Related to that, another concern is traffic. All that new activity does bring new traffic, but that traffic doesn't need to mean more congestion. As Chloe just described, infill can help to support more multimodal transportation. Infill helps to shorten trips and reduce the number of driving trips by bringing people closer to shops, offices, and other destinations. It can also have a more direct effect through site improvements, which are partly determined by those design standards, and also by helping to fund local road improvements. So many of the other concerns regarding infill development can kind of fit together under the umbrella of community character. Here we're talking about the physical character of the community, being the appearance, size, and style of the buildings. I'm going to start by going through some of those standards for dimensions and design of infill that you can put in place to shape new development. Then we'll get into how those standards are established and administered to protect the community's character and history. First up, we're going to look at setbacks. These are very commonly used and they're a dimensional standard. Basically, they say how far buildings are apart from property lines, from the street, and from other buildings. So side setbacks create side yards, front setbacks create front yards, and so on. Generally, you're looking to establish a consistent line. So in the photos on the left, we see two infill developments in Bridgeport that were built 12 years apart. You can see how the front buildings match and help to give a street a more consistent appearance despite the differing building styles. And with setbacks and other dimensional standards, consistency is usually the goal. Here in this example, taken from Lansdale's Residential Design Review Manual, you can see how fine-tuned these can be, where front setbacks are set block by block along residential streets so that the infill development matches its immediate surroundings. Another important measurement to talk about here is building height. This can be a source of apprehension sometimes for infill development. So setting height standards, whether minimums or maximums, helps to ensure that new development fits in. In the photo on the lower left, though, we actually see an example of how infill can add height while still respecting the appearance of its surroundings. This is a Montgomery Award-winning Cricket Flats development. And what you see here is a step back. The top two floors are stepped back further from the street than the lower floors, helping to reduce their visibility. In other cases, you may wish to set standards for the features of a building's facade. In commercial settings, this usually means storefronts, but in residential settings, this often applies to porches. They're pretty common in historic development, but would otherwise often be omitted from newer homes. And so in these examples, we see how infill has shared that feature. Other standards can be set for the size, shape, and details of a building's bulk or massing. These requirements influence a building's appearance, but can have an effect on the scale and intensity of development. Now, there are many other aspects of infill development that you might want to influence through design standards, from what materials or architectural styles are used to the placement of garages. With all of these measurements and features to consider, it's helpful to take a closer look at an example of how infill development has worked to see how these pieces can come together. So the case study that I've got for you here is Arbor Muse. It's a townhome development in Norristown on DeKalb Street. It was built in 2015 on what was a vacant site. And so in an aerial view, you can see how the three buildings of this development fit into their surroundings. One thing I'd point out here is how the site's parking is tucked away behind the buildings, kind of out of sight. And all you can see there are those two driveways between the buildings. Now, from the street, you can see more of how the building's development, the development's buildings match with their surroundings, with materials, architectural styles that kind of blend in. You see they have red bricks, the trim, the dormer windows, etc. Going back to the aerial, notice how the development's setbacks are different from those of their immediate neighbors. It's shorter than what you had in the historic development, but matching with those on the neighboring block. Now, from the ground though, you can see how some of these standards start to work together. Despite having different front setback distance, different building heights, and different root styles, these elements have all combined here so that the new development and the old have a very similar appearance from the street and roughly the same apparent size. So there are many standards that you can set, many possible combinations of how to shape the infill development and guide your community's ongoing evolution. Historic patterns can help to set an example. Looking at Bridgeport again, you can see how homes built in 3 different centuries stand side by side. However, it all starts by figuring out what matters most to your community. Are you aiming for consistency or more variation? Now, with all these decisions, I'm going to turn it back over to Mike, who will tell you more about setting these standards and how to administer them.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. Infill regulations can be located in the zoning, subdivision, and land development or historic architectural review board ordinances. The restrictiveness of infill regulations ranges from less, such as the Saldo, to more, such as a HARB ordinance. Zoning regulations are stronger than those of the Saldo. Placing infill regulations in zoning makes them stronger than the Saldo in part because an applicant seeking relief from a zoning requirement would require a variance from the zoning hearing board. Zoning is the most common way of regulating infill. Context-specific zoning ensures that new development respects the built environment. Strength of standards can be calibrated to the desires of the community. Let's look at the images on this slide. If much of the development in your community looks like the community in the upper left, you might want to create stronger infill regulations which ensure that new development closely matches the style of development in the neighborhood. Conversely, your community may not have a dominant architectural style, may simply want to prevent extreme outliers in setbacks or massing. The image in the lower left from Abington zoning depicts homes of different architectural styles, but where infill required is still required to have key physical characteristics consistent with those of its neighbors. Saldo infill standards are not as strong as zoning standards because waivers are easier to obtain than variances. However, Saldos can be an appropriate place for specific infill design regulations where a municipality recognizes that due to the level of detail in the requirements, it would be reasonable to make relief easier to obtain than a variance. Landscaping requirements, often found in the Saldo, can help soften the impact of infill on existing adjacent development. A design review manual can be used to convey through illustrations the design ideals that a community would like infill development to include. This manual can be used to help determine how well a proposed land development meets infill requirements. And the design review process can use the following in an advisory role on infill: the Municipal Planning Commission, professional staff or consultants, or a new design review board. In the case of a historic district approved by the state, it can use a historic architectural review board. And now Chloe will talk about the relationship between infill development and community preservation.
Thanks, Mike. So we've talked about the benefits of infill, ways to make sure that infill development enhances and fits in with your existing built environment. But what happens if you're seeing so much infill that you're losing a lot of the buildings that you really care about in your community? Some change is inevitable, but how do we balance that change with the possible need for preservation? If you're finding that infill development is driving too many teardowns in your community, there's 3 things to check. One is to check your ordinances. Is the difference between what is permitted by ordinance to be built in your community and what's already there too great? If so, that will encourage teardowns. Stay tuned for our later presentation on ordinance testing to help you assess this about your ordinances. Second, do your ordinances allow the conversion of especially institutional or industrial properties to residential or commercial uses? If not, that will encourage those types of buildings to be torn down in your community. So you may want to revise ordinances to encourage adaptive reuse to preserve these buildings that often have great character. And finally, your community can consider adopting some type of historic preservation ordinance. These historic preservation ordinances can protect important historic sites, cultural sites within your community. The power for how to preserve historic sites in your community is held primarily at the local level. Zoning ordinances are the most common way to regulate historic buildings, although there are also historic districts that are under a different state enabling act. Historic districts are only applicable in certain places, and they would create a historic architectural review board. That has the strongest, it requires all new development to undergo design review and obtain a certificate of appropriateness. There are also high standards for being able to demolish something within the historic district. We sometimes hear misconceptions about historic preservation and possible ordinances, so let's quickly address some of the most common ones. Sometimes we hear that buildings on the National Register are protected. That's actually not true in most cases, unless a local ordinance protects them or state or federal funding is involved in the project. There's no prevention of demolition, even if a building is on the National Register. Sometimes we hear communities hesitate to enact any sort of historic preservation ordinance because the community is afraid that will mean they can't replace their windows, or the color of their house will be restricted, kind of paint they can use. That's completely up to the municipality. Historic preservation ordinance does not have to regulate anything about alterations if that's not what the community desires. Sometimes we hear that there's a concern that historic preservation ordinances are only bad for property owners. They can only provide restrictions. That's actually not true. There can be incentives or bonuses provided to property owners, and your historic preservation ordinance could have only incentives, only restrictions, or a combination of both types of things. So that's a very quick overview about historic preservation ordinances, but there's a variety of options, and that it is possible to try to preserve important buildings in your community. So in summary, there are a variety of types of infill development, and we see them throughout the county frequently. There are a lot of reasons why we like to see infill and why it provides benefits for our communities. Here's this example of a Main Street development in Mohr. There are ways to ensure that new development, infill development, fits in well with the surrounding community. There's various things that you can regulate and different options for how to do it to ensure that, you know, in a single family neighborhood, like it's pictured here, you see one larger home subdivided into 3 mid-sized homes in Hatfield Borough. You're seeing something that's within the scale of what's around it. And there are ways to preserve important sites within your community through various historic preservation methods. So that's our quick summary of infill development issues. We'd like to also thank our colleagues, Tim Kenichi and Ann Levitt-Gruberger, who contributed text and photos and ideas to this presentation, though they didn't speak with you today. So we can take some time now to hear your experiences with infill development in your community, or to hear your questions. And we invite you to submit questions in the chat, or we're going to just open it up. If you have something you'd like to say, tell us about infill in your community, you're welcome to go ahead and unmute and share. So I know we have a variety of municipalities represented here. Are there particular aspects of infill development that you think would be most important to regulate in your community, or that you've already taken steps to regulate in your community? Okay, we have a question in the chat, so think about what I just asked and we'll take this. So the question is about accessory dwelling units. Do local governments support accessory dwelling units? I can start with that one. It's a good question, and it's definitely a hot topic in and of itself. A lot of communities have been discussing this in recent years, and there's a lot of interest in it. I think generally speaking, communities are very supportive of the idea of an accessory dwelling unit that is for an aging or disabled family member. And that's often where the conversation starts in our communities, where someone may bring up the issue, oh, we want to put a unit over our garage for, the in-law suite, something else. And that's, broadly speaking, tends to be fairly palatable to local municipalities. When we get to the idea of allowing property owners to add a unit that they can rent to just anyone, it's a mix. I think some communities are open to that and some are resistant to that type of infill. I would say, in my opinion, that it's appropriate to have some standards for an accessory dwelling unit. If you're in a single family neighborhood, you want to ensure that there's appropriate setbacks and you don't want a new unit that's right on top of someone else's property. But there's a lot of cases in which it would be barely perceptible from the street or the surrounding neighbors that there even is another unit there. Anyone else on our panel want to respond to that, or staff members want to talk about ADUs?
I just had one thing to add, Chloe, and that's one of the things that we've noticed with ADUs lately is that municipalities generally do not allow them to be rented. So unfortunately, they've so far not been a great option from what we've seen for providing additional affordable housing opportunities. And that is something that's done in different places across the nation, of course. And one of the things that we would encourage municipalities to consider going forward.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more quick thing on that, which is that research and places that are monitoring other parts of the country where ADUs are being permitted, broadly permitted, construction of new ADUs is very slow. They see only a handful of permit applications per year. So it's not as if ADUs were suddenly allowed in a certain municipality, every single home would suddenly have a second unit. It would just be, a couple, and each year might be adding. That would be our prediction, I think, based on what people are seeing in other parts of the country. So it might not be as big a change as some people fear.
Chloe, this is Dulcie Flaherty.
Hi, Dulcie, go ahead.
I am very interested in ADUs because I'm in the demographic that is looking at where our children live and how we can spend more time with them, whether our children are near or far. But also, more importantly, the changes that we're in process now with lifestyle changes. COVID had really changed what people's work, home life schedule is, often what their needs are for childcare, with the challenges young couples have with childcare. It's profound. So I think not only from my personal view of well-designed, well-placed ADUs, it is important for us to try to work with communities to understand that young families and older families may need different options in housing. With the prices where they are, with life changes as they are progressing, we don't even know where we're going to come out the other end. We just need more options. And the ADU is a really good one for lots of reasons.
All right. Thank you for that comment, Dulcie, and appreciate you attending and sharing your perspective. I think when you're comparing different options for adding housing units within our county, adding ADUs is one of the least disruptive ways to do it. And if you know anyone who's been looking for a place to buy or rent, it's really difficult right now to find somewhere, and the prices are sky high and nothing's on the market for very long. So providing additional housing units and housing options in the county would be very beneficial for many people who wish to live here. There's varying ways to do that, and adding a few smaller units here and there on single family lots is a way that would not change the character of parts of the county very significantly, but would still contribute to the housing stock. Would anyone else like to share experiences with infill in your community, or particular aspects of infill development that you think would be the most important to ensure that it fits in your community? Those of you attending, have you seen new development being built in already developed areas, and did it work? Yes and yes. Okay, that's good. When I've been working throughout the county, sometimes I hear people say, oh, we don't want, high-rise towers here in our small town Main Street or in our community. And sometimes that's saying, oh, if we're going to have more dense development, it's going to be like that, and that would be terrible. And I do think there's ways to look at the existing conditions on the ground and think incrementally what would be just very slightly more dense, or what can you fit in a smaller area that would work with the surrounding communities. And if you really take the time to look at what's there and what kind of regulations will help something fit in well, that there can be a lot of really successful infill that's beneficial to the community.
Chloe, this is Pattie. I just wanted to add on to that. I appreciate seeing some really good examples of infill throughout the county that you presented in this session. I was heartened to see that many of them were Montgomery Award winners. Again, trying to put a plug in for that program that we have, where we really do like to recognize good design and planning. So I think what you're showing and what this has helped to show is that infill is a good word. It can be very positive, and it can be done to the point where it becomes such a benefit to the community that it can be award winning. So thank you for showing those great examples.
Yeah, thanks,
Pattie.
Chloe. This is Scott. This is Scott again, and we've turned the corner. Sometime about 5-7 years ago, development proposals that have come in through the county and to the Planning Commission have, infill has outweighed in terms of numbers from more greenfield or open area development. So that used to be where all the bulk of new development came, but no longer is the case. So we've seen good and sometimes not so good, but we're learning, and I think our development community is learning better ways to fit in both large and small. 200 unit apartment building and even a small set of twins. Both have their own challenges and strategies to making them work and be a benefit as opposed to causing more problems. So I'll let you go. I think we'll keep on time here for our next presentation. Thank you very much, Chloe, Mike, and John, for that great presentation from our community planning staff. We're going to switch gears now and talk about electric vehicles, the trends and land uses. We're already dealing, I think, with impacts from electric vehicles and what they require. We've seen it in some of our retail environments and also in home design, but this is only the beginning, as I think we all know. It's only going to intensify and really will have major impacts in how we utilize what can be a very beneficial change in the way automobiles operate. So today we're going to learn about what's happening and what the future holds. And we're going to start with Matt Popek, our Assistant Manager of the Transportation Section, and his team, including a guest from DVRPC. So Matt, if you're ready.
Thank you very much, Scott. Looks like I will have to, can everyone see that? Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. For the middle session of our hot topics today, we're going to be looking at electric vehicles and hopefully go through a day in the life of some of the sample projects, sample ideas that people may have. You may have seen commercials for electric vehicles on television or something like that, both classic models of newer vehicles that you've seen in the past, or even newer cars that are coming out and just are available now because we have electric vehicles in the first place. We're hoping to spend the next 20 minutes or so trying to go through the different issues and perspectives that are available for electric vehicles, both from the regional and even countrywide perspective, as well as digging a little bit deeper into what Montgomery County is trying to do and how our plans are fitting into what everybody else is seeing with those vehicles. To start, we are actually very fortunate to have a member from that regional area, Sean Greene, the Air Quality Programs Manager at DVRPC, who's going to walk us through some of the regional perspective and some of the just basic facts and figures about what these electric vehicles are and how they may be coming into play in the near future. So I'll turn it over to Sean.
Great, thank you, Matt, and thank you folks for having me. I'm going to, this presentation is going to be a 10,000 foot view of some of the things going on in our region with electric vehicles. But the one thing that I want you to remember at the end is, the time to plan for this future is really now, to get out ahead of this issue and welcome it into your community because it's coming. Electric vehicles are coming to your community if they're not already there. Next slide, please. So just go over some of the basic benefits of electric vehicles, take a look at some of the statistics and trends with the EVs. I want to introduce you to some of the funding opportunities that have come out in the recent infrastructure bill, and then just leave you with some thoughts. Next slide, please. So pretty widely accepted benefits of electric vehicles for air quality, cost of operations, and even energy security. When we take a look at both greenhouse gases and the criteria of pollutants that impact public health and the environment, electric vehicles are often referred to as zero emissions vehicles because they have no tailpipe emissions. And so there are immediate benefits to the communities in which they operate, right? But depending on the source of power for electricity generation, that emission benefit can go up and down, but it is still widely accepted that at the basis, electric vehicles, regardless of the energy input to generate that electricity, are lower emissions than traditional internal combustion engines. The cost of operations based on fuel and repairs, they have fewer mechanical parts. They're cheaper to maintain. The cost of fuel is certainly less, even, especially in this environment of $5 gasoline and, inefficient SUVs. Cost of operations based on that DEP fact sheet that I have linked there could be, up to half of a regular gasoline powered vehicle. And of course, the more electric vehicles we have in our county and our communities encourages us to look at and invest in renewable energy, local renewable energy. I live in the borough of Lansdale, and the amount of solar power that we're using in that borough is encouraging. And we have models right here in Montgomery County on how we can increase our investment in renewable energy. Next slide, please. So EVs are coming, sales are accelerating. In 2011, I believe there were 408 electric vehicles sold in the nation. As of January 2022, 2.5 million electric vehicles sold in this country. And they're coming because all the automakers have some form or another of a plan to roll out an electric vehicle model. And while some are more aggressive than others, based on the demographics of their customers, all of them from Hyundai to Jaguar have plans for new EV models. And of course, the model's range and cost varies from 100 miles per full battery to, up over 350 miles per full battery, from $30,000 for a vehicle to over $100,000. But the trends stand. The vehicle's ranges are increasing year by year, and the costs are starting to come down. Next slide, please. And of course, as Matt had mentioned, they're already here. We have about, a little over 3,600 registered plug-in electric vehicles in Montgomery County. Now, this might seem low, but when you think about it, sales of electric vehicles are increasing. So the newer vehicles tend to be electric vehicles, but we still have this legacy fleet of gasoline powered vehicles, of which those new sales are, what look like on the surface as a small percentage. Nationwide, we almost, we're a little bit over 1% of new vehicle sales are electric vehicles, but in places like California, it's over 10.5%. In Pennsylvania, it's almost 2% of new vehicle sales are electric vehicles. And in New Jersey, which I hate to give them any credit for anything, 3.5% of new vehicle sales are electric. And we're starting to see publicly available charging pop up around our communities. We have, almost 60 of those DC fast chargers. Those are those high-powered, quick charge fast chargers. Now, of course, almost half of those are Tesla, but 240 of those level 2 ports, which will give you about, between 12 and 25 miles of range per hour of charging. A little bit faster than plugging in out of your outlet at home. But also an opportunity to charge in the public when you're out doing errands, when you're out at work, when you're at a transit station. These things are in our communities, and there are a number of applications of mobile apps that will help you find the nearest charger. Now, I do want to mention that in our communities in Montgomery County, we do have a range of adoption rates of electric vehicles. And a lot of that depends on the demographics of our communities. We see more EVs in communities that have garages where people can pull into the garage and charge. The price of those vehicles, tend to show up first in more affluent, communities. But that environment's changing too, as those prices come down, as vehicles start to appear on the secondary market. So we need to start thinking about how we're going to serve those communities that don't have that access. Next slide, please. Under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the new federal infrastructure bill, there are a number of programs that will support our local, county, and state governments in funding electric vehicles and electric vehicle infrastructure. For Pennsylvania alone, the bipartisan infrastructure law, another name for the IIJA, we have $172 million for Pennsylvania alone for DC fast chargers on our alternative fuel corridors. And I'm just going to touch these and go into it a little bit later. But there are other programs outside of that national electric vehicle infrastructure bill. We have a carbon reduction program, Pennsylvania, $265 million to reduce greenhouse gases. The traditional CMAQ program, over $110 million, almost $114 million for projects to improve air quality. Electric vehicle infrastructure and fleet replacements, vehicle replacements certainly meet the goals of all of those programs. Next slide, please. And there are also discretionary or competitive programs. And many of these competitive programs include electric vehicle eligibility. Just last week, I sat in on a program from the EPA for an electric school bus program, nationwide competitive program, $5 billion to electrify school buses across the nation. Number of competitive funds for electric vehicles. And the NEVI, $2.5 billion for competitive funds to put electric vehicle charging infrastructure in our communities. Next slide, please. And just to drill down on this program just a little bit more, the initial formula funds at 172 million that's coming to Pennsylvania is for investment on our interstates and interstate-like highways. So in our region, it's US 30 and all the interstates, 476, 76, Pennsylvania Turnpike Northeast Extension. And that's to put those DC fast chargers at interchanges on those highways to facilitate that long distance travel. We're still waiting on information on the discretionary competitive program, but it's, you know, it's important to realize that it's going to be a national competition for that $2.5 billion. So if you want to start filling the gaps in our EV infrastructure, creating corridors in the communities in Montgomery and the surrounding counties, the time to prepare for these nationally competitive programs is now. Start talking to your neighbors now and figuring out how we can bring these infrastructure dollars back to southeastern Pennsylvania by working with our neighbors and partner governments. And all of these infrastructure bill funds have the common goals of equity. You know, how can we increase access to these vehicles and this infrastructure to everybody in our county to fight climate change, improve resiliency and safety, and encourage economic growth? Great opportunities for economic growth around this new technology. And all of these IIJA funds have special consideration, whether they're eligibility considerations or reduced cost share considerations for disadvantaged and rural communities, which of course Montgomery County has its share of both. Next slide, please. And just some thoughts from a regional perspective, sitting here at 6th Street in downtown Philadelphia. You know, some of the things that we encourage you to think about moving forward with regards to EVs, with charging and access and coordination. You know, I think I saw a statistic that 80% of charging is going to take place at home or work. And for municipalities, that means you have to work with your utilities to manage power demand. But certainly start to think about your local codes and regulations around building and safety and parking to ensure access to those parts of your community for folks that don't have garages or off-street parking, or maybe live in an apartment building. And how are they going to charge, whether it's at work or whether it's through public charging? Certainly going to take some thinking. Access, right? Again, how are you going to provide access to folks without off-street parking of those multifamily units? And this is really going to be an essential factor if we're going to grow EV ownership from just, you know, some of those single family unit communities and affluent communities into all the communities in our county. And, you know, partnering and coordination is certainly going to be key to developing a functional transportation network so that folks that live in your community that work somewhere else are comfortable owning and driving an EV so that they know they can charge along the way or at either end of their trip. And some of these questions, particularly around, you know, parking and where can folks charge and having that access are, you know, they're difficult questions. And so thinking about your codes and access now, allowing some flexibility while technology and these considerations change, you know, the time to have those conversations and explore those issues is now to be prepared, particularly if we want to access some of those federal and state funds that I had mentioned in my last slide. So next slide, please. So, you know, I think we can all consider, or we all agree, right? The government's role is to facilitate the movement of goods and people and protect our natural resources and public health. And we need to provide equal access and opportunity, you know, for everybody that lives in our community, from the folks that want to park at the hitching post to the folks that want to charge their electric vehicle. You know, it's our role as government to provide that access and those opportunities. This federal and state funding, the advent of this new technology also provides us with opportunities to cut costs for our fleet management. You know, stick our toe into converting some of our municipal fleets into electric vehicles. You know, whether we want to become technological leaders or support our residents' options to take advantage of these new opportunities. You know, I would really like to encourage folks to take notice of this upcoming technology and start to prepare for, you know, how we want to fold this into our communities. And, you know, from DVRPC standpoint, we really want to offer, you know, our help where we can. So thank you for your time and your attention. Matt, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thanks so much, Sean. It's great to hear that our partners down at DVRPC are helping out with as much of the planning and coordination as we can. And I'll make the broader point for you as we transition to the county perspective. We're trying to make sure that municipalities are understanding how what is being rolled out now with infrastructure or buildings or anything that's supposed to have a lifespan of several decades, how does it get integrated for what this technology is coming to be? And just so that everybody doesn't start designing things for a Betamax or something like that, we want to try to make sure that we're doing it the right way. So along with two other colleagues from the county, we are going to run through a couple of more points that are a little bit lower level, taking it down from that 10,000 feet from Sean. And again, thanks very much, Sean, for joining us, down to that couple thousand feet. We'll look at some of the benefits and downsides, a little bit more detail than what Sean just gave us, and then hopefully take you through a day in the life of an electric vehicle owner and the various places where somebody may choose to charge a vehicle. And we'll end briefly with some long-term expectations and a note that all of this that has been going on already has been accounted for in various plans and will certainly be accounted for in all sorts of plans going into the future. So as part of that introduction, it's important to note just a little bit more of the detail of what Sean was giving us. Not only is Montgomery County up there in terms of adoption, in terms of just raw numbers. We have thousands of these electric vehicles already on our roadways. But as of 2020, we were #1 in the state. There were more electric vehicles registered in Montgomery County than in any other county in Pennsylvania. Sure, we're one of the bigger ones, but we were outpacing Allegheny County, we were outpacing Philadelphia County. So the electric vehicle issue of what to do with them is already here for us. And again, as Sean mentioned, there's already over 90 locations for level 2 and DC fast charging locations throughout. But we certainly encourage people to check out the Department of Energy's website, and you'll see they have an interactive map with the dots spread fairly decently around the county. As part of those federal funding infrastructure bills, we are hoping to increase the spread of this and potentially get it in more key locations, especially those near highway interchanges. There are, of course, benefits and downsides of this technology, just like there would be with any new technology. As Sean mentioned, there's certainly a decrease of the non-point source combustion pollution, and it is often, though not always, cheaper than petroleum, and the ability to have more energy security on our side and less reliance on the global petroleum market, especially in times like these, isn't all that bad of a thing. With fewer moving parts in vehicles, you have a reduction in your vehicle maintenance costs. And from a land use and municipality perspective, you may be able to, in the future, reuse or repurpose some of the gas stations and other automobile maintenance facilities and buildings that are already dotting our landscape. However, there are two sides to this coin, and a single occupant vehicle, electric vehicle, is still a single occupancy vehicle. Really, these electric vehicles, we do not see them as particularly solving any of our traffic congestion problems. If you are driving alone by yourself in an electric vehicle, you are still taking up space on a roadway and causing congestion. Those power sources are a tricky situation, as we around here in Montgomery County, most of our power comes from the Limerick Nuclear Generating Station, but from a larger energy grid perspective across the rest of the country, we are still fairly reliant on fossil fuels such as coal and gas for our power generation. It's important enough that the IPCC brought it up during their latest climate change report about making sure that there was a transition to cleaner electric fuels in the first place, instead of just outsourcing the problem upstream to a larger power facility. Even though there might not be as many vehicle maintenance costs, there are still issues that come up with, again, any vehicle. You have brake dust that gets generated anytime you stop. Other car materials may have to be recycled, and those batteries themselves are still somewhat of an issue for us to figure out how to recycle. The MCPC overall does believe that electric vehicles' benefits outweigh their downsides, but it's certainly enough of a consideration, and there are enough sides to all of this story that we want to make sure that this fits into a broader transportation conversation, and that we do not solely focus on electric vehicles at the downside of public transit, non-motorized transportation, or any of those broader transportation environmentally friendly ideas that we have for a 21st century commute. Now I'm going to turn it over to two of my colleagues to walk you through some of the different types of places where someone may choose to charge their vehicles. We'll start with our environmental planning assistant manager, John Lesher, to take us through some of the day in the life of an electric vehicle owner. John?
Thank you very much, Matt. What we wanted to do was, when you think of EVs and you think of EV charging, you think about how's it going to affect my daily life. And as stakeholders and municipalities and at the county level, we need to be concerned with these locations as well. And what are the charging profiles? How are they being used? And what are some of the issues associated with each of these locations? Not that you're going to need to charge at each of these if you're going through your day, but these are locations that you may need to charge through the course of your vehicle ownership. As Sean said, most of the people who are currently EV owners live in single family charging. That's more than 80% of the EV charging actually takes place at home. As you can see throughout the county, we have a tremendous amount, hundreds of thousands of single family detached and attached units that possibly have garages or driveways where EV charging can be done. From a technical perspective, level 1 charging uses basic house current, while level 2 uses the same voltage as a dryer. And those can still be installed, but either of them can be installed in garages or out in the driveways. Some of the issues that we need to be concerned about, installation quality. If things are not installed correctly, it's a hazard to the homeowner, to the business owner, wherever these may be installed, to the homeowner where it may be installed. And it also will give EV charging a bad name. So we want to make sure that quality is done. One of the things that needs to happen on a municipal level is ensuring that the education and the best practices around permitting is emphasized, so that the people who are inspecting these know exactly what to look for. And then how do we incentivize implementation from a municipal perspective or the county perspective? What can we do to help people get these to increase EV ownership? Next slide, please. So I live in Philadelphia and I live in a row home. So the multifamily house charging is near and dear to me, because when we think about this, we think about those who live in apartment buildings and also people like myself who live in a row home and I park in the public right away. It's interesting to look at these two pictures. The one on the left is from Bainbridge Street near my house, where the city of Philadelphia ran a street charging program with dedicated spacing. The other picture is from Stafford Street, where somebody decided to dedicate some parking for themselves with the use of a very technical piece of equipment called a sawhorse. So that is one of the issues. How do we deal with the parking, with the charging in the right of way? If it's in an apartment building, it's costly to retrofit into those parking lots. For on-street parking, who's going to pay and who uses it? Can anybody drive up and just plug into that charger? What are the protocols going to be? And how do we balance public access to those spots? Living in Philadelphia, I will tell you that people are very protective of their parking spots outside their house and on their street. And if one is being reserved for a separate type of vehicle, it does cause issues and it does cause conversations. So these are all issues that we're working through at the county to try to assist our stakeholders as we do implementation for EV charging. Next slide. So we go from home and sometimes we go to work. How can we charge there? As you can see, once again, throwing out some statistics, the number of business parks, the number of industrial inventory places, and also this doesn't even include the number of office units that we have in the county where people could come and charge. Level 2 is the most common, The level ones would be easy to install because they use basic current and they could add 30 to 40 miles a day. Recently, Pennsylvania signed a multi-state agreement where, as you can see, we're transitioning towards zero emission new medium and heavy duty trucks by 2050. But how do we get there? How do we electrify a distribution fleet of vehicles is one of the big issues that we're encountering. And how do we have the infrastructure to charge those vehicles through the course of the day? Once again, costly to retrofit existing parking lots. So let's think about requiring some of the infrastructure to be placed into new developments when these parking lots are being installed. And then the employee interactions. How do we promote the environmental benefits? How do we promote the fact that a workplace has electric vehicle charging? So hopefully we retain employees and that it's a benefit that people want to come to this workplace and want to work for this company. And then once we have those, how do we work through the process of making sure that somebody doesn't park there and just stay parked there all day unnecessarily, and they're not sharing with their coworkers as they should. Now I'm going to hand it over to Kevin Chavous to walk us through the rest of our day.
Thank you, John. And I can't stress this enough. The key to all of this, obviously, is we need to expand the infrastructure. That's probably, you can't say that enough. And like Sean mentioned, and John mentioned as well, most charging takes place at home, but most is not all. So in the case of commercial centers, as we know, we live here, Montgomery County is this large, wonderful, vibrant, prosperous county. And there are a lot of areas that, the retail facilities are abundant. And there's, 150 sites totaling over 30 million square feet offering commercial retail services. And this represents a huge opportunity. And right now, there's a partnership with EV service providers, and and they're talking about, and they're actually doing it rather. They're installing these charging facilities in shopping centers. Currently, there are over 100 charging stations in retail centers across the county. And shopping center owners are very bullish on this. They're very excited about this and they're embracing it because, it's an opportunity to get people in your mall, in your store, in your restaurant. And the key to this is, while your car's charging, that's giving you time to, shop, browse, walk around, enjoy the open space, whatever. And, they call it dwell time. And any kind of retail facility, you want people to come, you want people to stay, it's because if they stay, they're going to spend money. So, that's a key to why shopping center owners really want this. When looking at existing centers, many of which, as we're coming out of the pandemic and there's underutilized centers. So there is ample space to accommodate facilities in these shopping center parking lots. And again, we need this. It's very important. Looking at on the other side, one of the biggest issues with this is solutions for EV charging in traditional village centers, downtowns, and main streets. Like John mentioned, like parallel parking, charging stations in the right of way. You may have to lose conventional parking spaces. There are issues surrounding that, and that's something that it's a concern. Okay, next slide. Okay, moving on to public property charging. What are we talking about when we say public property? Basically talking about state, county, municipal level governmental facilities. And these include government buildings, they include libraries, they include parks. And once again, it's an opportunity. For example, the PA Department of Conservation and Natural Resources they've launched a program to install these EV facilities within state parks around the state. Right now, there are 33 state parks, including the one in Fort Washington, that have fast charging facilities. One of the concerns, one of the issues is who pays for this. If it's government land and they're offering the service, is the service free? Do you pay? Who's paying for electricity? Is it a municipality? Is it the state? So that's an issue that still needs to be resolved. And then the other kind of a minor issue is balancing public access with government operations, or say you have a park, you have people, park goers, and they need a place to park, but you have people charging there. And again, how do you balance that? Next slide, please. Okay, traveling and charging on vacation. As we know, electric cars have a range. It varies from car to car, from make to make. But if I were going to go to the Poconos, yeah, I can charge my car up at night. I can get there on a single charge. If I want to go to, say, Cape Cod, well, that's an issue. Somewhere along the way in Connecticut or wherever, I'm going to have to stop to charge at my electric vehicle. So right now, the goal is to address the needs of long distance car travel. When you're traveling locally, 10 miles, 20 miles, you're okay. But if you need to go 300 miles, 400 miles, 500 miles, people do like to drive. People do like to travel across the country. So right now, the Federal Highway Administration has started a program. It's called Alternative Fuel Corridors. And they're addressing this issue where they're looking at the entire national highway system. And they're looking at, okay, how do we deal with this problem? How do we increase the infrastructure? Also, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act also has a provision that, is bringing money in, and they're also assisting with addressing this issue and filling in gaps in the charging network. For example, on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, not at all right now, but at select service plazas, including the one in King of Prussia, there are charging facilities available. So if you're traveling across the state on the interstate, you have that opportunity to charge as you drive along. As Sean mentioned, there are a number of charging apps that are very helpful because, all you need to do is just go to your app and it'll tell you there's a charging station here, there's a charging station there. And that also helps people, when they're driving, finding places to charge. And right now, hotel chains, a number of them are already starting to offer EV charging on site as an incentive to stay at their facility. So if you're traveling, come to our place. We'll have a place for you to charge your car. And, while you're vacationing, you've got that covered. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now we have a number of resources for you. If you want to learn more about this, I'm going to pass this back to Matt and he'll fill you in. All right, thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. And yes, you will notice that a lot of these resources and plans that have been developed by various states, regions, and the federal government also match with some of the long-term expectations and plans that have been adopted as we look towards the future. Monco 2040, our sustainable and comprehensive plan, for example, mentions that we should be adapting to changing energy needs and assisting municipalities as we adjust to those changes. The DVRPC region has its own electric vehicle plan and a long-range plan trying to advance green vehicle technologies, and that EV roadmap that Sean mentioned earlier is an important part of this too. We understand that we don't have all of the answers just yet, as overall electric vehicles are still being rolled out, but we certainly encourage you all to start thinking about it for your communities. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the Planning Commission here. Between environmental planning and transportation planning and even design planning, we expect to have a number of questions and items fielded across all of the different issues and items that might come up as the decades go by. So we want to thank you for listening to our section of this. We also want to thank Simon Bernard and Matthew Edmond and Ann Nygaard for the support in pulling all of this particular presentation together. And I know we're running a little short on time, but we do have a little bit of time, I think, for questions if anybody has this. I think the question I wanted to use to jumpstart the conversation would be, has anybody in fact purchased an EV so far? And if not, why were you scared off from doing so? What could we do as a region, as a county, as a set of municipalities to start making that choice a better one to fit for more Montgomery County residents? Feel free to answer in the chat. Feel free to unmute yourself. We're happy to answer any of the questions that you have about this right now.
Matt, this is Chris Leswing at Lower Merion.
Hey, Chris.
Hi. I don't have an electric car, but I do have an electric bicycle, right? So as a planner, I'm worried. I bought an electric bicycle about a year ago to explore last mile transit connection, something planners are always working on. And now I've started to take this bike and use it for commuting and such. I've now ridden enough that I've run out of gas. I've run out of charge sometimes. I found out what happens. Will there be availability that you're seeing with these public facilities that'll also be able to adapt to other sorts of vehicles, your scooters, your bicycles, your micro mobility vehicles that will, is it a simple adapter, or how could that work for all electric vehicles, just not electric cars?
That's a great question, Chris. I know for the most part, as these electric vehicle chargers are getting installed, they are designed for cars. There have been ideas floated about in the region for things that are known as mobility hubs, where you are supposed to be able to service all of the 21st century transportation needs all in one spot, whether it's electric vehicles or bike racks and service stations or ride sharing items. Whether we can start trying to say integrating electric bike charging into some of those mobility hubs so that you have a place to say, I know I'm going to park here for my retail experience. I can charge my car, I can charge my bike, and I can get here safely on a bike in the first place with all of the bike lanes and bike routes that the county is trying to assist with rolling out. I think that's a useful part of how all of this is structured. You may be one of the few people that end up running out of a charge on your e-bikes, and bravo to you for making it go that far. But that has to be something that the overall region incorporates into its thinking as we are trying to drive the conversation on using electric power to move us around however it may be.
And the infrastructure is adoptable too. Once that's placed in, you can use it for, again, these mobility hubs allow you to do it for different things. So again, the key to it, you need the infrastructure to start with. And that's what we're kind of working on right now.
We have a couple of quick questions from the chat that I'll just read off as well. So Erica asked, how can EACs contribute to advancing these projects locally and regionally? I think I'd like to toss that over to John.
That is a good question. I mean, I think what EACs can do at this point is to be a proponent for EVs, for the EV infrastructure, to make sure that the voice is heard, that this is something that the municipality should be tackling, and then be ready. I feel like the conversations I've had with municipalities have really focused on, well, we need to understand where the charging should go. We need to understand, before we start to invest in putting the charger, where are the best spots for this? And I've always thought EACs were great conduits for that conversation between the government and the public. So the EACs could volunteer. They could work collaboratively with their municipal government on those planning efforts to realize where the best investments are for EVs, so that you're getting literally the most bang, the most charge for your buck. So as these vehicles are becoming more and more prevalent, we're making smart decisions in the very beginning and doing, we have success stories. So that would be my first blush answer to that one.
Thanks, Sean. We had another question about what is the life cycle of charging stations? Sean, do you happen to know any more about that?
So what I've seen with partnering with Camden County in New Jersey, they put in a number of public charging stations, level 2 charging stations in I guess it was 2013, and now they're right at where they're replacing them. So, if that's a typical situation, I apologize, I don't know a more definitive answer, but if that's a typical situation in 8-9 years.
Makes sense. And I guess our last question from Colleen, what advice can you provide to allow for regulations for single family homes, since a majority of the charging will occur in the home? Retrofits are more expensive, so as a new build, it is best. Well, that's, I think, part of where we need to start driving and make sure it could be included in an ordinance, for example, making sure that there is, the proper power supplies to wherever somebody may be deciding to charge. I don't know if Kevin has researched this specifically, or I know Chloe just turned on her camera. She may have something to say about this.
Well, I think you might want to toss that one back to Lower Merion Township. I believe the saldo they adopted last week includes a regulation to that effect.
That's great. More people should follow what Lower Merion Township is doing.
Matt, this is Dulce. One thing I must say, I have one of my sons has 2 young children. He has both an electric car. Now, he does live in California where the price of gas is exorbitant. He has an electric car, but he has the electric bike fitted out with 2 child seats. And he goes on the very well-defined and developed bike corridors in Culver City to take his kids to preschool. So he is considered the coolest dad in the preschool, but he also gets there faster than most of the people in their cars because he can go on the bike lanes with these 2 little kids in their helmets on this electric bike. So I think having really good, safe, well-designed bike lanes will also help with having more people utilize electric bikes in our built environments.
Just trying to design for the future. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. We're hitting on time here. We want to get to our last presentation. Thank you so much, Matt, John, and Sean for coming in as well. A lot of information there, and we'll only be talking more about that as we move forward. So now we're going to go to our last presentation on testing your local code ordinance. And we have some guests from Lower Merion with us today, but Pattie Guttenplan, our Assistant Director of Design and Outreach, is going to kick us off. Pattie?
Hey, thank you, Scott. So yeah, we are going to be talking about testing your zoning and subdivision land development ordinances. And before you decide that this is the time to take a nap or to drop off, because boy, does that sound boring, I want to assure you it is not. And thanks for the shout out from Chloe from that previous session on infill development. And we do have 4 speakers today. We have Chris Leswing and Colleen Hall from Lower Merion Township, and Marley, Bice, and myself from Montgomery County Planning Commission. So the idea of testing code language is not a new one. And when we here at MCPC have been involved in the past with writing code language, we would certainly test those standards, especially design standards. But today, what we want to talk about is a more hands-on approach. So if I can get to the next slide, there we go. So as a quick introduction, I want to say that by using real site examples, you can sometimes unveil unintended consequences that your zoning allows. Does the language actually encourage your building placement and coverage, and what it will look like when it's built? Our approach, which Marley will go into in more detail in a few minutes, includes several very different sites in several different districts. And as we think about subdivision, along with testing your zoning, you can test your saldo. And with our work at Lower Merion Township, who you'll hear from next, we went back and tested their saldo as they were revising that more recently to see if it really worked. And interestingly enough, we found that it didn't always work. So the saldo testing can also inform on the zoning standards in some cases, and then that prompted people to go back to the zoning. For example, in this, what you're showing here is your landscape standard in some cases. So in your landscape, is it reasonable? Do you think it's reasonable what you want for percentage of green coverage? And if you think so, do they still fit with everything else on the site? Again, does your language lead to the built environment that you're looking for? So we will get into that shortly, but first, let me hand this off to Chris Leswing, the Director of Building and Planning at Lower Merion Township, who will talk about why do you want to test your code?
Thanks, Pattie. I think I'm going to touch on a couple other things that were already brought up about ADUs and adaptive reuse with why you're doing your testing. So it's from my perspective, I'm the planning director for Lower Merion Township, and I often am tasked with adopting codes, and that's my job. And it's kind of challenging. And one of the things that we need to do is we need to get things done right, but we also need to get them done in a hurry. We have a very demanding public, and we have a lot of things that we need to do. In 2016, the township adopted a comprehensive plan. It's a massive document. It was great. Took us years to do. We had hundreds and hundreds of meetings, lots of public outreach. We talked to everybody we could whenever we could about anything we could. We completely exhausted. It was comprehensive in its comprehensiveness. And it was a wonderful plan. And we had a lot of help from Montgomery County in pulling that together. Out of that plan came some very clear goals. The first recommendation is we needed to update our land use codes. And it gave us clear guidance of what we wanted to do with that. We wanted to preserve our residential neighborhoods, stop inappropriate development in the single family neighborhoods that were already developed. We wanted to revitalize our commercial areas, continue to add mixed use development, make them more transit oriented, and make them more pedestrian friendly and very attractive with design standards. And then we also wanted to create institutional districts. Lower Merion, as a build out residential community, has a lot of institutions. It has schools, it has country clubs, it has seminaries, it has some odd ducks and common institutions. Many of our institutions are in these, since they're in residential neighborhoods, are more intense than the surrounding residential fabric. They've previously been approved through special exception process. We needed to create zoning that allowed them to transition, to continue to evolve. Because when something of higher intensity changes in a residential district, it puts a lot of stress on that, and that creates a lot of public outcry and a lot of public stress. So these were our goals that we needed to do. So we had a really good program to do that. So as we finish this, we wanted to continue to our zoning update. We wanted to do it in our house, and our governing body didn't want us to do that. We took too long with the comprehensive plan. It was just too involved a process. We had new board leadership, and that board leadership gave us a mandate. Give us a zoning code in 18 months. And with that, they also gave us resources, and we were able to advertise and do a national search and settled on Dwani Platter Zyberg. DPZ Associates, the people that created the form-based code, came and became our consultant. And one of the reasons why they were retained was just not because they were great zoning consultants, but they could get this done in 18 months. And we got started, and we wanted to do this. And the reason we wanted to get this done, and our board leadership wanted to get this done, is because they interviewed a number of other leadership leaders throughout the county, and they all said, when you're adopting your zoning code, you need to do it quick. Because if you either adopt your zoning code in 2 years or you never adopt it, because all of the special interests, all of the single issues start to become these turf wars and fights that are constantly relitigated throughout the process. So we needed to strike very quickly. So we went back with DPZ, and it was a fabulous process, very exhausting. Colleen, who's on this Zoom with me, we spent an awful lot of time, a lot of evening meetings. I think there was a total somewhere around 75 meetings in this 18-month period to try to talk through these issues, refine. Well, we knew what the issues were, but what were the solutions, and trying to get everybody on board with it. And with that, the residential piece was rather straightforward. It took a lot of mapping, took a lot of time, but we were essentially just making sure you couldn't get new subdivisions. So you're upzoning in a lot of ways. The commercial areas, that's fairly straightforward, bringing in a lot of design standards and mapping that. It was a big task, but it's straightforward. The institutional piece was a bit challenging because nobody had ever quite done it the way that we wanted to. And we didn't quite know, we'd never found anybody who had quite the institutions that we had. So we got to the 18-month part, getting ready to adopt the code, and out of the blue, somebody says, I don't trust the code. And we had some other commissioners, Lower Merion's 14 commissioners, and a couple said, we don't trust it. We don't know if it's going to work. And it was about the institutions. And we said, from staff standpoint, we're sure it works. And they said, you're tired, you're exhausted, we worked you too hard, you don't know that. What are you going to do? And just at that time, Philadelphia had adopted their zoning code, and Philadelphia had tested their zoning code. And people are familiar, Lower Merion's right next to Philadelphia. People are familiar with that process and said, well, why don't you test it? And with that, we still had a deadline to be able to need to pull this off. And with those kind of resources, I called my best friends in planning. I went to Scott and I went to Pattie, and we sat, we had a conversation. And I said, I really need some help, guys. And I'm going to say, I don't think I've ever seen Pattie smile as much when I asked her to do this. Pattie was absolutely ecstatic. So I'm always encouraging everybody to go to your local planning commission for help with this, because the planning commission jumped into this wholeheartedly to help us pull this off. And we had a real expedited time frame to do it. So we were able, to staff standpoint, to manage some local resources where we have relationships with local land use attorneys, local builders, local developers. And we brought all these people together and we were able to test the code. And we were able to, out of that came some changes, but it also, with that testing process, and other people explained that during the process, particularly Colleen next, is we opened it up to the public. Everybody saw it. It was transparent. And we put out these hard, difficult sites from a trusted third party to be able to review them. And at the end, we made a few changes, but it only took us a few more months. So instead of 18 months, it took us a little less than 2 years to fully adopt the code. And when it was adopted unanimously to full public support. And I like to consider that quite a success. In that, with the institutions, one of the biggest issues was about residential conversion, that adaptive reuse of institutional properties. Those were some of the things that really the county was able to come in and help us to test a lot. We were also, at the staff standpoint, wanted to get this done quick because we had built in what we thought were some really cool things that if this process went on much longer, I think we were very worried that some of the more development adverse members of our community would pull some of those things out. And one of those was ADUs that we had put into this code that nobody had looked at it too quickly. So getting this thing adopted within that time frame really worked out well. So I'm a huge proponent of testing your code. We did it. We were so successful with our zoning code. And as Pattie mentioned, we built that into the scope of our Saldo update. So we're not going to go forward with any of these code updates without actually building testing into the end of it. It's not optional, it's mandatory. Big fan because it helps us to get it done quicker, but it also helps us to get it done correctly. So I'm going to turn it over to other members of the panel to kind of build on the narrative.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Pattie, and thanks, Chris, for kicking this off. Now, I will be giving a general overview of the testing process that we developed by working with Merion. The process can vary based on which type of code you're testing. If it's zoning versus Saldo, you might be focused on different aspects, as well as the scope. You could test a full code or just a single district, or you might have a new standard like adding impervious coverage limits to residential districts. That might be something you'd want to test first. But the process would generally follow these 5 steps: selecting your test sites, doing some internal analysis on those sites, organizing a charrette or independent testing with other professionals if possible. As part of that charrette or independent testing, you might have a group pinup to share the results. And lastly, a findings report with recommendations will be completed. Next slide. The first step is site selection. We found it is very important to use actual developable sites within the community to evaluate the code standards against. This way, you know you're using sites with real life constraints, such as street frontages, irregular lot shapes, adjacent land uses, topography, etc. We recommend mapping all of the sites to evaluate their geographic distribution. Make sure you're looking at all corners of the municipality if applicable. Also, it's important to consider test sites that will represent a range of zoning districts, land use development scenarios, and lot sizes. And making a list of key aspects of the code you want to test, and then evaluating which test sites will help you test each code aspect is helpful at this stage as you're finalizing the list of test sites. Make sure the sites will allow you to adequately explore all of the aspects of the code you wanted to test going into the process. Next slide. So once the final list of test sites is determined, MCPC planners can conduct internal site analysis. We call it pre-testing on each site. We gather information we think will be important for testers to be able to reference on concise reference sheets. For example, the zoning and land use context can be important because many standards such as setbacks and buffer widths can vary based on what your neighboring zoning district is. We create large-scale site plans for the testers to sketch on and conduct their testing. In most cases, this can be just dimension property outline and street frontages to give the context. This is also the time to prepare other resources and personnel you will need for the in-person charrette or independent testing. In person, we found that it was great to just let people get creative and have lots of supplies, scales, paper, scissors, glue, whatever their method for conceptualizing the site. For independent testing, we went the extra step to put each site plan into AutoCAD, so professionals who preferred to use that software could use that to lay out the site and place landscaping and driveways and things. During this step, MCPC also completes several test sites from start to finish, which allows us to test out the full process and understand better what tools and information the testers will need. Next. If your process allows, we recommend organizing a day for outside experts, engineers, developers, architects, zoning officers, and planners to all get together and brainstorm how your proposed ordinance language would apply to the test sites. And this is something that worked really well for Lower Merion when we were testing their zoning especially. The actual technique may vary based on, again, the type of code testing you're doing. The design day charrette works well for testing development sites in small groups where we're able to do quick zoning massing studies as a group. And the independent testing worked well for testing standards that require detailed measurements and calculations, such as parking lot island ratios and buffer widths and plantings. Either way, the goal is to break the code. Try to maximize the development potential on the site and see where things feel squished, where there are opportunities or inconsistencies or where questions might arise. Next. As part of that design day or as a follow-up to independent testing, an important next step is a group pinup where participants can present their work, their findings from the testing process to the full group and municipal staff. And this is a great way to identify common issues and opportunities for improvements and just have professional feedback back and forth. Next. In the last step, key findings from the testing process are typically summarized in a memo, including specific recommendations. We like to use test site plan illustrations and photos to communicate the revisions to the Planning Commission and governing body. And here are just a couple examples of takeaways from the sourdough testing we did in Lower Merion Township. We, on the left side, have screenshots of some of the streetscape design findings. When we tested streetscape design standards in the draft code, such as sidewalk width, verge width, street tree spacing, and had some recommendations. One of our testers especially recommended increasing the verge width in residential areas in particular to create more of a green tree lawn feeling, which would be consistent with the established residential character. On the right is a sketch of a redesign of a parking lot of an existing development using the draft sourdough standards for parking lot greening. We found that this would result in reduced parking capacity on the site by requiring planting strips of a certain width and planting islands every so many spaces and keeping the buildings as they were. We found that that reduced the amount of parking you could fit on the site. And this just highlights how the zoning and sourdough both influence the amount and character of developments in your community. And it's important to understand how they interrelate and whether the resulting development reflects the goals of your community. Next slide, please. And lastly, here are a couple of more examples from takeaways of the zoning testing we'd done earlier for the township. Starting on the bottom left, there was a requirement for 80 to 90% of the ground floor of a building to be storefront in some commercial zoning districts that we tested. And our testers suggested reducing the storefront requirement on secondary streets, but at the same time recognized that master planning of key commercial areas may be the best way to determine which are the secondary streets. On the top image, you can see we evaluated setbacks and step backs on upper floors for infill type development scenarios using both plan view and 3D views, and recommended a side step back be added in certain situations based on that. And on the bottom right, summary of our testing of a shopping center redevelopment that found that facade articulation requirements could be added to enhance integration of any contemporary development to the adjacent traditional downtown areas. So now I'll hand it back to Lower Merion Township, to Colleen Hall, to talk a little more about the takeaways from the township's perspective and how they were able to use the testing results of both the zoning and SALDO.
Thank you, Marley and Pattie, for asking Lower Merion to talk about the testing process that we utilized for both the zoning code in 2019 and the SALDO just this past year. Both of these processes were both different in scale and design, but the both codes benefited great from the great work that the county provided. The timing of the testing that we did in the process is very late, so you do want to build that into your timeline. You have to basically have a draft code that's only almost ready for adoption. When you do this, you have a stronger code in the end. For us at Lower Merion, it gained the trust of our public, our design professional, and ultimately our elected officials. As Chris mentioned, in the zoning code, we worked with TPC partners in a 2-year process of drafting the code. When we got close to the end, our elected officials felt the new requirements needed some hands-on testing and a more local perspective. So we, as Chris said, reached out to the county and we wanted to discuss the potential of testing the code or breaking the code. We had some discussions about what best format this would be. And ultimately, after several meetings, we felt like the design charrette would be the best format. That ask was great, and the timeline that we provided was actually very tight. The county staff was exceptional with the amount of background data, both the 3-dimensional and plan views that we were able to utilize in the design day charrette helped the day go off. You know, it was a wonderful day. We asked private design professionals to join us for the charrette. We had engineers, planners, architects, landscape architects, civic leaders. They worked along with us in small groups with our staff and county staff. And our purpose in it, we basically stayed sort of in the background and asked any questions or answered any questions and just let the group, take over in the designs. A key takeaway that I wanted to share, when you're drafting a code and it's 18 months, you get very close to that document and you do want to take a step back and allow other people to interpret the code and see the holes that you may not see because you are too close to it. Some of the examples, as you can see from the frontage occupation that came out of the design today shred, well, that's a hard word to say. When the frontage occupation was working with it, there's a certain percentage that you set up that the building has to occupy the frontage. When the designers were doing the SketchUps, they figured out that there was not ability to have pedestrian spaces, forecourts, or public gathering space at the corner. So we had to work in those exemptions in our code to allow for them to, not be counted as a frontage, to kind of incentivize those. And that was a really good thing that came out of the testing. Another thing that came out that Marley mentioned, we did have their responsibility for active ground floor commercial, and we did have a certain percentage set up. However, we didn't do a depth of that needed to occur on that first floor. So you can have a certain token commercial space that come in, and we wanted to set up a minimum depth for that. So that was 2 of the examples that we had for the zoning code. For the adoption of the SALDO, we just completed that last month. That was a different process since it was an all staff level process, and we worked alongside of the Montgomery County planning staff. We drafted the code and the public process, and adoption was completed in a year. At the beginning of the process, as Chris mentioned, we knew we wanted to have the test included, but however, with a year timeline, it was still tight, to fit it in at the end. When we asked the county, they sure were, wanted to do it right away. It was going to be a different process since it was going to be virtual. We did do it on a Zoom format, and it actually worked fairly well. One of the key takeaways from that is that when we looked at the landscape standards, we determined that we needed to refine them for more Lower Merion's built-out community. Working with the landscape architects that were in that design day charrette, they were able to, give us some really good examples and make those tailor our standards for Lower Merion. So that was a really important part of that. As I stated earlier, establishing trust in the public process was a key component of both of these projects. Using the local insight and the design knowledge of the Montgomery County staff was a big component of that effort. And I can't be more pleased with both of the outcomes of, unanimous approved by elected officials as of last week, just in the Saldo. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Colleen and Chris. I guess I'm smiling. So this was, yeah, again, I think we all really enjoyed this process. And so let me just wrap up what we've all been talking about. And then I'll open it up for some questions. So I do want you to have a few other takeaways more about what our process and what to think about if you think, wow, we don't have this big of a project going on. It doesn't have to be the full-blown charrette. To have to involve the outside testers necessarily. That's beneficial. We did find that especially beneficial for conversations about making sure that the public has the buy-in, but you can still do testing that's in-house and we can still find issues to address. So, and we've done this for a few of our municipalities even more recently when we've done some rewrite of code for East Greenville and for Collegeville. And it doesn't have to be the whole code. It can involve just one district and how that will affect different sizes or shaped lots in that district. And what different land uses might be allowed in that district. And we're currently doing this right now. We're just starting that much smaller process, but just a process of testing for one of our communities to test the Main Street code or Main Street ordinance that they're looking at. And it can start with, like, if you're looking at your subdivision land development ordinance, it can start with an audit of recent land developments of what is most often waived in those projects? What is a developer always coming in and asking for a waiver of? And that sort of gives you an idea of what maybe is not working in your code. Or if you're reviewing that annual report that your zoning hearing board does, what are the most requested waivers? Those often give, or variances, excuse me, those often give an idea of what maybe isn't working in your code to then think about, okay, maybe I need to test something in this district. It can be as simple as a land development test where we do some massing, or it can be, again, that design charrette day. So, and if you think about the theme, big changes on a small scale, these were small tweaks. These can be small tweaks to your code, but they can lead to very big changes in your built environment. So I want to open that up. First, I want to thank you for tuning in and listening and staying till the end. Again, I want to thank our presenters today. We are listed on the right-hand side of the slide, but I also want to give a shout out to Eric Jarrell and Kevin Chavous from our staff who helped us with this presentation, helped us on that design day as well in those design sessions. And we're open for any questions you may have for any one of us. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see the screen. There comes Scott. Okay.
Sure. Well, you did get the last slot there, Pattie. So it might be tough as the dinner bell starts ringing.
And I do have one more slide to share once you're done. Do you want me to share that now, or do you want to wait for some questions to come in? Do we have?
Yeah, go ahead. And yeah, if there's anything anyone wants to say, feel free to raise your hand or chime in, but go ahead and share that off.
Okay.
I'll promote our next event, which is only 3 short weeks away. On June 16th, we're going to be at a largely in-person event again. This will be in Pottstown, and we'll be covering strategies for walking and biking in local communities. Pottstown's a great place to have that discussion and also see a lot of great public projects that have occurred in that borough, and see how it's impacting the community. There's going to be a trolley tour optional if you come an hour early at 4:30. The presentations will begin at 5:30, and we're looking to we'll likely have Zoom available for the presentation part if you can't make it, but we encourage anyone who can to get out there and join us early for that exciting afternoon. So that, again, that is June 16th. You can register online at our at Planning Smarter at moncopa.org/planning. All right, so we hope to see many of you there, and unless there's anything else, we can wrap up today. I want to thank everyone for coming, really, and all the presenters for all 3 sections did a lot of great work. And we appreciate it. This will be available online as well as the presentations. And if you have any further questions down the line, feel free to reach out to our staff. I will be happy to follow up with you. All right, and thank you, especially on the last section, Chris and Colleen, for coming in and joining us, and safe e-bike travels home. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.